Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Crime, Justice and the General Election. Over the next hour, we're going to be looking over the party manifestos and their crime and justice offer, and we'll be spending most of the time looking at the Labour manifesto because I think it's pretty clear that Labour are likely to form the next government. Joining me to look at the manifestos are Crook, Jo Phoenix, Phil Bowen and Ian Acheson, and I think you can tell already, I don't think we're going to be short of things to say. So let's get straight into it. We're going to start with the Labour manifesto and its crime and justice chapter, which is entitled Take Back Our Streets. Now, the Labour Party manifesto chapter is broken down into 9 sections. The final section on historical injustices, we're not going to be looking at in this discussion because it kind of covers important areas, but areas that are not central to crime and criminal justice. So we're going to look at the other 8 sections, and we'll start with the section on visible neighbourhood policing. There are 2 main pledges in that section. The first is the pledge to recruit thousands of more police officers, about 13,000 is what Labour is offering. And the second is what Labour's calling their neighbourhood policing guarantee, which is just kind of bringing more police onto the streets in the neighbourhoods. So let's start with the pledge for 13,000 police officers, and we'll start with Phil. I mean, Phil, we've got, I think, more or less record numbers of police officers currently after a bit of a dip between about 2010 and 2020. So, the obvious question is, do we really need even more police officers than we currently have?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So, I mean, I guess my thoughts about this are primarily informed by the Police Foundation strategic review of policing, which kind of argued forcefully and for me convincingly the demand being placed on policing and community safety more generally is rising in its complexity. And therefore, I think the idea of additional resources being made available for community safety, protection of communities, investigation of very complex crime, whether that's violence against women and girls or fraud, is welcome. I was listening to an interview only yesterday with Sir Mark Rowley about the lack of intelligence gathering he felt he had at a community level. So I think the idea of both increasing the amount of resources going into policing, but also a kind of making sure some of those resources go into neighbourhood policing seems to me to be right. I think one of the things I think that is problematic, though, in this area is the sort of chasing specific targets around officer numbers. It's sort of an obvious way of signaling to the public commitments to law and order, but sometimes I think that can drive us down a line which resources could be better used, for example, in sort of, something like, we know that police often have to attend incidents involving people with severe mental health crises. And you think, if we had some of those resources but could improve our resources around responding to that, that might not necessarily be a police officer who's best at doing that. We might want to use other resources. So I think the general point...
That sounds a bit more like this is about kind of something slightly more nebulous, which is about public confidence and police legitimacy rather than necessarily being a very effective way of tackling ever more crime.
Well, I think it's sort of, I think the sort of what I think they're driving at in the visible neighbourhood stuff is clearly a kind of commitment to both officer numbers and community policing. I think the point I'm trying to make is, if we're going to put more resources into policing community safety, we need to be open to the idea that some of those resources shouldn't just be tied up with recruiting more officers, because police officers can do a number of jobs, but I think there are other jobs that the police are having to do sometimes with police officers. You think different types of skills would be better used.
Okay. Now, Labour sort of said that this policy is going to cost around £400 million, or that's where they've identified the money. They're going to tackle it apparently through the Police Efficiency and Collaboration Programme. Now, I think a lot of us have been around in this field for some years. Governments will always say, "Oh, we're going to find efficiency savings, and that's how we'll pay for it. And I'm just kind of wondering really how realistic it is that you're going to be able to pay for all these additional police officers. It's only about 30,000 per police officer as well, so it's not a huge amount of money. I mean, Ian, I don't know if you have any kind of thoughts on the, whether they're going to be effective in finding this money purely through efficiency savings.
Well, let's look at the practical application of efficiency savings. So since 2015, on average, 2 police stations have closed every fortnight in England and Wales. People need visible and accountable policing in communities. I mean, I'm as baffled as the rest of us probably are about where these efficiency savings are going to come from. I don't think you could describe a situation at the moment where we've got lots more police officers, but they only appear in the poorest communities responding to emergencies as necessarily productive or desirable. Certainly what I want to see are police stations being opened in communities that are tortured by a culture of criminal impunity and crime, which affects their ontological security. So regardless of what we see in crime statistics, people's sense of their personal security is grotesquely undermined when they're living in these communities, when they can't go out at night, when they are relying on local shops, small corner shops that can't afford CCTV and security guards, where shoplifting has become routine and police have stopped investigating those sorts of crimes on the basis of proportionality. Certainly in Scotland, that's clearly the case. So, what I'm tired of hearing, I guess, as well, is an argument that says, and this is related to future discussions we might have on prisons, is that increasing community police officers, neighbourhood policing, will mean a bulge in crime. Well, actually, if the police are operating in the way that they were intended to do in the reforms in the 1998 Crime and Disorder Act and the introduction of youth offending teams, they would be in those communities stopping and solving problems before you project kids onto a rather dismal criminal justice conveyor belt, which means that once they're on it, it's very hard to get them back off it again. So I would see the reintroduction of policing to neighbourhoods as having huge benefits in lots of different directions. The prevention of crime, the restoration of police legitimacy, which is, let's be honest, under severe strain at the moment. And just because we've got all these police officers, much like prison officers, that are being reintroduced, I think you were quite generous in saying there's been a bit of a dip, Richard. It's been a catastrophic, swinging series of cuts, criminally stupid austerity cuts that have got us to this position. And we're replacing, not like for like, experience has been driven out, experienced neighbourhood and community policing has been driven out, and less experienced police officers are coming into the service with higher expectations, and they're leaving in ever greater numbers as well, being disillusioned with what policing is actually offering them. So
thank you very much. Yeah.
That's what I do.
No, really interesting. I mean, it's worth saying that this whole section, this whole chapter on crime and justice in the Labour Manifesto is pretty police heavy. There are 7 pictures, 5 of them are police related, and there's another couple of sections on policing, which we will come to during the course of this discussion. So I think there'll be time to pick up on some of these themes, but let's move on to the next section in the manifesto, which is entitled Cracking Down on Antisocial Behaviour. And there are a couple of areas in this which I wanted us to pick up on. One is what Labour are calling respect orders, which sound remarkably like the old antisocial behaviour orders, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And then the other one is on shoplifting. It's a bit of a mishmash of policies here, supposedly scrapping the effective immunity. I'm quoting from the manifesto, scrap the effective immunity for some shoplifting introduced by the Conservatives, and creating also a new offence of assaults on shop workers. But let's start with the respect orders, which are there apparently to ban persistent adult offenders from town centres, stamp out issues like public drinking and drug use, fly tippers, vandals, and so on and so forth. Francis, what do you think about this? I mean, we've both been knocking around this field for a while. It does feel a bit like just another go at the ASBO, but calling it a different name.
Indeed, it does. And I think it links in a way to what Ian was saying about particular communities having very special problems. partly with antisocial behaviour, drugs and crime. And I do actually support the idea of locating police stations in communities, partly as a preventive measure. I think that's possible. But of course, the two things that you're most likely to be a victim of is fraud or domestic violence. And having a police officer wandering up and down the street randomly on my high road is not going to prevent me being beaten up by my partner, or prevent me being a victim of Russian fraud, or any other kind of checkbook fraud or whatever. And in fact, I was a victim of fraud when I put a card in and it was skimmed and they took £750, and the machine was right next to the police station. I mean, they were actually located literally next to each other. So I'm not sure that having police around necessarily prevents crime. And of course, Labour has history on targeting working class and poor areas in order to hit arbitrary targets for saying they're doing something. When they had the antisocial behaviour orders, they imprisoned women who were working in the sex trade. They were imprisoning children. They were creating people with mental health problems, and they were scooping up people into the criminal justice system who really should have been in health or other facilities.
So is that an argument for, because I mean, we probably all of us could have stories about, people sitting on park benches, getting drunk and then being a nuisance, or, other kind of, issues of antisocial behavior. Is the issue here not, well, let's just not bother dealing with these problems, but actually through these kinds of civil orders that can quite quickly end up with a criminal conviction? Those are not the right way of dealing with these problems. Is that the issue?
Yes, I think it is. It's using the criminal justice system to deal with poverty.
Yeah.
Social inequality, economic inequality, mental health problems, housing problems, alienation, young people stuck out of school because of the COVID and when they didn't go to school. It's all those are real problems. And I think the Labour Party has talked about that. Education and things are very important. That's part of their wanting to do something about it, but they keep slipping. They have a tendency to use the criminal justice system against poor people instead of actually solving the problems.
Let's move on to the other pledge that I mentioned about shoplifting, which is an interesting one because there was some years ago the legislation was passed to basically mean that if you were found guilty of shoplifting, or you could shoplift up to £200 of goods, then it was an expedited process through summary prosecution in order supposedly to speed up the justice system and kind of stop the courts being clogged up with lots of small petty cases. And at least my reading of what Labour are proposing is effectively just to reverse that. So, which may be wrong. I'd be interested in people's thoughts on this, but I'm just wondering on this, one of the examples where bit of legislation goes through, another government comes in, and then they change it back to where it started. And in another 5 years' time, we'll be introducing a cap on shoplifting because we realise the courts are just stuffed full of petty offences. So I don't know. I mean, Jo, I don't know if you have any kind of thoughts on that. Sort of watching, the way that justice operated over the years.
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple of thoughts, but I want to kind of roll back a little bit to the respect orders and this together. So when I first read this, I thought, oh my goodness, is this nothing more than a kind of 21st century reboot of a broken windows style thesis? Let's just deal with the visible manifestations of crime that everyone knows about, rather than actually deal with the elephant in the room, which, as Francis very eloquently said, has much more to do with poverty. And on shoplifting, that immediately, of course, we know, don't we, that the people who are going to get caught up in the criminal justice system with this are going to be women. We know this. And bringing back a kind of take them through the courts means it's going to clog the courts up even more. So then you sit there and think, well, how can a Labour Party or any party with a manifesto like this say we're going to actually bring in effect, speed up justice, particularly over the stuff to do with women and girls, and at the same time, actually slow it back down again? It just seems like it's missing the whole point altogether. and providing a couple of buzzword things here that will attract votes. I don't get it. I absolutely don't. I think this is not the weakest, but this is a very weak part of the manifesto.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to the next section, which is called Knife Crime Action Plan. And it comes with seemingly quite a big pledge here. Labour saying that we aim to halve knife crime in a decade. Wow, now there's a whole question about how you measure knife crime, but nonetheless, quite a bold, potentially considered by some maybe a rather bold pledge. There's a number of other pledges in this section, and I'll just very quickly run through the main ones. There's a pledge to refer to a youth offending team every young person caught in possession of a knife. There is also a pledge to set up a new Youth Futures programme with a network of hubs involved with youth workers and mental health support workers and others involved. There's local crime prevention partnerships, which was supposedly going to proactively identify young people at risk and placing youth workers and mentors in accident and emergency pupil referral units and other things. There's also some tougher sanctions. There's going to be a further attempt to ban these so-called zombie knives and ninja swords and machetes and all the rest. And there's also going to be a new offence for criminal exploitation of children. So quite a lot to get our teeth into there. Let's stay with Jo. I don't know do we want to maybe start with these mandatory referrals to youth offending teams for those caught with knives? Is that
I'd like to start with the second of the pledge, the Youth Futures pledge, if possible. Right. So when I read this, a couple of things went through my mind immediately, and I think it's one of those things of if you live long enough, you keep re-seeing the same thing being recycled. When I saw knife crime, I thought, oh, great. Are they going to make use of the findings of the all-party parliamentary inquiry into serious youth violence? Because clearly this section, there's a kind of conflation of knife crime and youth crime here. And then I thought, well, the Youth Futures, that might be the bit where they make use of all of the empirical evidence, all of the research, the inquiry, all of that. And they say they're going to create that they will be these Youth Futures hubs and local prevention partnerships, and that they'll be properly resourced at approximately 95 million and 5 million respectively. Okay, let's just put this in context. Between 2010 and 2018, there were 750 million pounds worth of cuts to youth services, right? So that they are now saying, we're going to deal with youth knife crime effectively by making sure everybody has a referral to a youth offending team and these Youth Futures. This doesn't even begin to touch the surface of why it is that we might be having problems with knife crime.
So is the issue here, is the issue here one to do with resourcing? Actually, if they were saying rather than 95 million, it was going to be 950 million. Is it a resourcing issue, or is it a kind of a principle issue? Because on the face of it, kind of seems if we're going to have these kinds of prevention hubs and trying to kind of, as it were, get ahead of the problem, on the face of it, that sounds like quite a good thing. But it sounds like from what you're saying, it's rather underpowered in terms of resourcing.
It's underpowered in terms of resourcing, but also what's the other thing that we know from after the Crime and Disorder Act and the youth offending teams were introduced, and we were taking a prevention style approach. What we saw was an industrial scale expansion of the youth justice team. And as I read it, I was like, oh, are we going back to the tagging young people who are at risk of becoming at risk of doing something? So under-resourced and extremely underwhelming in terms of its ideas here.
And then on the other side, we've also got these enforcement measures. And the one that, struck me and that kind of stood out a bit for me was this about, zombie knives and ninja swords or whatever they're called. And but particularly the suggestion that executives of online companies selling these weapons could themselves be sanctioned, and targeted. I don't know, Ian, do you have any kind of thoughts on that, about the sort of actual sanctioning of, company executives who are selling these knives? Is that going to be enforceable
Well,
if they're in other jurisdictions?
Yeah, no, it's not, and I think this is very powerfully suggestive of action without actually making any difference. Because if you ban these knives, people will find other bladed weapons to attack people with. I take a bit of issue here with the whole rhetoric that's being described in this manifesto. To be honest, Richard, I mean, it sounds like it's been written by somebody who hasn't seen the 1998 Crime and Disorder Act, which is rather ironic since it was introduced by Labour last time they were in power, which means that most kids, if not all kids, who've been found in possession of a knife will be referred to a youth offending team. But I want to say something slightly different and possibly a bit provocative here. I think what we need to do in relation to children murdering other children, which is an absolutely astonishing state of affairs that has become almost normalised, particularly in London, is vastly increased.
That's outrageous, Ian. That's just not true.
Is vastly
just not
increased.
true.
If I can finish, Francis, I didn't interrupt you. Is increase the certainty of being caught. One of the things we've got to do here to stop other parents being bereaved, who incidentally don't talk an awful lot about the environmental concerns here, is to actually make sure the police can intervene and catch people who are carrying knives around. That is the start. That is necessary. It's in itself, of course, insufficient to solve the problem. But that is the start of a process. And it's one of the things that is always forgotten about when you hear politicians of every stripe who are, parroting the public health approach to knife crime, that it was predicated in Strathclyde on catching people who were armed with knives and making life effectively impossible for them until they decided to change. And that's where you have to add in all the other stuff that will actually divert people, young people, older people who are carrying knives, from a completely destructive, a path that they're taking.
Thank you, Ian. I think I think it's really important in this discussion we have a range of views. So I think that's a really, interesting and important and challenging view that you're offering. Francis, I sense you kind of have maybe
I agree with a lot of what Ian's saying, but I mean, to say that it's been normalised that children are killing each other in London is completely irresponsible and not true. Of course, there's a problem. Nobody's denying there's a problem, but there always has been a problem of youth violence between boys. It's usually a male issue, but you've got to get it in context, and you've got to be rational and sensible about it, and not hysterical, I think. Otherwise, you can't deal with it properly. And I think that the idea that Jo was talking about, the ideas they've got about sort of prevention and working with young people is really, really important. We can save lives that way. You don't save lives through policing the kids. I mean, in my own area, we have no youth service anymore. It's just gone. It's just completely gone. All the youth workers have gone. There's nothing for teenagers to do. And I'm in a sort of fairly leafy, mixed area of North London. It's that where you've got to put the money and the effort. I want to prevent it happening, and I want to save lives. And I want the kids to be able to lead exciting, interesting, challenging, fruitful, productive lives. That's what we all want.
Can I also just add, I guess the sort of mandatory referral point. I mean, it's pretty commonplace already that children linked with offences that include knife possession will be referred to youth justice services anyway. And I think the important thing is that when that assessment is then done, once that referral is made, that can lead obviously to a disposal that is about prosecution and conviction. But we can also find that children are, for example, victims of criminal exploitation, and that can lead to a completely different range of intervention and intelligence gathering. So, I mean, when I read that kind of mandatory referral point, I thought, that's pretty close to common practice anyway. And as long as that doesn't drive us down a catch, convict, prosecute route as a mandatory process, I don't have a problem with the idea of mandatory referral. It's a question of then trusting professionals to make the right assessment and the right judgment when that's done.
So does that mean in relation to, because the other thing that we need to move on, but there's this new offence of criminal exploitation of children, which is obviously kind of aimed broadly at the whole county lines kind of challenge. I mean, in a sentence, do you think that's a kind of a positive idea coming from Labour, Phil? And then maybe Ian, if you just want to kind of offer an in a sentence as well, and then we'll move on to the next.
I, I don't have a problem with it. Whether we could reasonably say that the kind of national referral mechanisms around child exploitation are working as well as they could do is more of an issue. It's more of a delivery issue, and I think that there's some evidence just it's not working as well as it should do. So, you know, again, putting stuff onto the statute book is in some ways easier than dealing with the actual delivery problems.
Okay, and Ian, on the criminal exploitation point.
I think we've got more than enough legislation on the books at the moment to be able to deal with this problem. And that includes, incidentally, something we haven't spoken about, and I'm sure we would disagree riotously on, and that is stop and search. I want to see fewer children being murdered by other children anywhere in the country. I think London, my point simply was that it is happening with such frequency now. We've become desensitized to it. And we should, you know, this should be a never event, not something that we just take as, you know, a consequence of living in an urban society in 2024.
Well, we may come back. I mean, although it's not explicit in Labour's manifesto, we may come back to stop and search in the other items on policing, because I know in the call out for questions and ideas from the audience, a number did point out stop and search as an area. So let's maybe come back. But in the meantime, let's move on to the next section in the manifesto, which is called Tackling Violence Against Women and Girls. And again, it opens with I think a very bold announcement, which is not an announcement. I mean, Labour's previously said this: halving violence against women and girls in a decade. And what they're pledging there is a mixture of some enforcement. So there's things like rape and sexual offences teams in every police station force, specialist rape courts, domestic abuse specialists, stalking protection orders, a new offence of spiking. And then alongside of that, some more things you might think of more of a prevention measure. The one that really stood out for me it says that misogyny is one root cause, and therefore Labour will ensure schools address misogyny and teach young people about healthy relationships and consent. And then another one, strengthening the rights and protections of women in cohabiting couples and for workplace whistleblowers. A bit of a kind of an omnibus there. I mean, Jo, do you think that these proposals and the round, if the intention is to halve violence against women and girls in a decade, do you kind of think that these proposals in the round form the basis for a credible plan to do so?
No. Sorry, I'll expand. I will expand. So it's very different. When I started looking at this, I thought, okay, well, it sounds great. It actually does sound good, and I'm very pleased to see a manifesto commitment to deal with violence against women. Would have liked to have dealt with male violence against women. I think that was an important symbolic message that they could have sent that they didn't. But I have to go back to the original stuff about better policing, because what I think about when I'm thinking about dealing with violence against, male violence against girls and women, police are incredibly important. And yet the one constituency where women have, or where the police lack legitimacy, is where it comes to the policing male violence against women. That's come up time and time again since I started researching. There's a problem around reporting some of this stuff. So we've got that to one side. Then we've got the setting up courts to try and deal with the backlog, because we know there's nearly 5 years between making a rape complaint and then getting a conviction. Now, of course, that has all sorts of stuff to do with how we're managing our court system. And I didn't see much here, apart from specialist courts, that would holistically take how we're managing our court system and the fact that, the criminal courts are at breaking point. The new offense of spiking, stalking protection orders, great, fine. But none of this stuff is dealing with some of the stuff that the violence against women sector are talking about. And I think that's where I got really upset when reading this. I thought, fine, but what about migrant women? What about protecting single-sex spaces? What about being able to deal with sex on recording of crimes? What about what we know is going on in the female prison estate? So what about all of those things that people are actually talking about at the moment? So for me, it just, again, a little bit like the stuff with youth, it just kind of fell really, really short, with one exception. I do absolutely 100% agree that we need rape and specialist sexual offences teams in every police force. But don't we already have quite a bit of that already? You know, specialist rape courts. Yes, that would be good because that would actually enable something to process quite quickly. But how do we have that when we have, you know, fewer judges, fewer lawyers, fewer, you know, resources for CPS, and on and on? I'll let other people talk. As far as I was concerned, great. Yeah, have cut in half violence against women and girls in a decade. How on earth are you going to measure that? And these measures aren't going to do it.
Thank you. I mean, I know it kind of feels as if the other panelists here, there seem to be quite a lot of noddings of head in when you were saying all of that. So I think unless anybody wants to offer a kind of a counter position, I think that covers it very well, and we should move on, because I think there's still quite a lot. We're only about halfway through the points of the Labour manifesto. So
Could I maybe just add one more thing, though?
please do.
Misogyny is one root cause. Male violence against women, misogyny is probably the root cause. And you don't cure misogyny by teaching young people in schools about healthy relationships and consent. You know, you do it much, much broader. And a lot of the violence against women prevention stuff has to do with what Francis was talking about earlier. And that's actually improving the economic and social conditions that women exist within so that they can actually leave, report, and so on.
And Labour needs to do something about women's rights and recognising that women have rights and women exist. That would be a start.
Wouldn't it just? Wouldn't it
I'm
just?
just putting that out there.
Thank
you.
Thank you for that, Francis. There's quite a lot going on in the chat. I can't possibly read all of it, or indeed probably any of it at this stage, because we've still got a lot to go. But do have a look. There's some really interesting comments that are being added in there, you know, responding to the points being made by the panelists. But let's move on to the next item, which is on better policing, it's called. And again, a range of pledges, some of them to do with standards, for example, the power to intervene for the police inspectorate, some suggestions here about improved vetting and training and a bar on prospective officers with a history of violence against women. There's also an interesting proposal for a new legal safeguard on strip searching for children and young people, a new fraud strategy, and also touching on the point that was made earlier about how Labour want to pay for all these new police officers, standardised procurement and investment in specialist capabilities. I don't think we can cover all of those, but I did want to pick up on a couple of these. I think starting with the police inspectorate point about the power to intervene, the police inspectorate, which sounds an awful lot to me like a shift from being an inspectorate to being a regulator of the police, which I think would be fair to say would be a fairly controversial move, even amongst the inspectorate themselves. So, Ian, what do you think about this idea of the police inspectorate having something approaching more regulatory or intervening powers?
Well, at the risk of doing some self-advertisement, you knew I was going to do that anyway, didn't you? But I suggest exactly the same thing in my book on the prisons crisis. I think, you know, the inspectorate, prisons inspectorate, and the police fire and rescue service inspectorates have done a great deal of good work in highlighting problems, but they effectively have no teeth. And I'm actually, you know, I'm pretty averse to the idea of giving more state authorities the ability to intervene, but I'll make an exception in this case. You know, I do think having a regulator with enforcement powers, particularly around accountability. I mean, we've just seen, for example, you know, an awful story about, you know, somebody who was delivering quite well for Northamptonshire as the police chief constable, being fired for basically having a CV that was a tissue of fantasies. And, you know, if you then extrapolate that to talking about a regulator, you might have somebody who's able to, you know, enforce standards, for example, the publication of the CVs of all people who want to apply for this very important job as a chief police officer in a constabulary.
But is there an argument? Is there not an argument that that should be the job of, let's say, the police and crime commissioners? or maybe the College of Policing or other things in relation to some of these regulatory functions, or you're
Sure.
not swayed by that argument?
Yeah, well, I'd say broadly speaking, local democratic accountability for the performance of police is important, but you probably do need specialists who are able to legally enforce standards, and that those being national standards rather than applicable to every PCC area, and determined by the competence. And some of them I wouldn't pay in washers, frankly. Some of them are quite good, but generally speaking, I don't think we've got great quality PCCs in the country. I'd like to see local accountability restored in a more practical way, using local authorities. That hasn't been effectual in the past, but I think the idea of having a capability to enforce standards is becoming more and more important when we're seeing constant scandals within the police, and we could suggest within the prisons as well, in relation to the delivery of services for people.
Okay, thank you. And this point about vets and bars on police officers who shouldn't be there, is there a tension here? And we saw this a few years ago when the chief inspector raised concerns about this. Is there a risk that in the rush to recruit additional police officers, it's going to create a tension between that and actually, frankly, just recruiting the wrong uns, as it were, and not actually really being able to ensure that the wrong officers are not being recruited?
No, I don't think that's a remotely acceptable trade-off, frankly. If we're going to recruit people,
but is there not a risk that's what will happen, I suppose?
I think that's down to the people who are doing the selection process to make sure that they have a process that carefully and correctly interrogates people's reasons for joining the police service. We shouldn't have anybody employed working in the police or the prison service or in any state organization which has the large amount of discretionary power, often operated in secret, that police and prison service have, who've had convictions or even have been suspected in relation to domestic violence, or being part of organizations that are viewed as extremists. I mean, that should be a baseline, and we shouldn't be interviewing people on Zoom. We should return, unfortunately, in some cases this is happening, to a process where capable people are vetting and selecting and filtering people into these services.
Okay.
But haven't we got a problem here, though, on one level? I mean, just sticking with the thing about anyone who's been convicted of domestic violence or crime against a woman and a girl. We know that around 1 in 3 women and girls at some point in their life have been abused in one way or another by a man. Now that means roughly, I don't know, maybe 30% of men have actually been involved in abusing a woman or a girl, and we don't know how many of those actually ever end up in the criminal justice system. And so trying to vet people is more than just knowing what their criminal history is. It's actually beginning to kind of understand who they are. But also the thing about the better policing, it's just interesting that nothing in here is about the training and support that police officers are going to get to be better police.
Which would, the implication of just what you said, that would be more, because it's not just about having a barrier to the wrong uns getting in, as it were, but having ongoing sort of monitoring, training, assessment, and other ways of ensuring that officers who are abusing their position are not actually continuing to be able to do so. There's a kind of an
it's also about unpicking some of the training that they've had. And of course, I'm going to make this sort of comment, but when you look at things like subjective-based policing of hate crime, the fact that Stonewall has run riot through our policing, we need to unpick some of the shall we say, and I'll say this slightly cagely. But thank you, Francis. Thank you. Inappropriate training that they've had. So there needs to be a much more holistic look. So
Richard, sorry, can I just go back on something that I think is incredibly important that Jo has said? All things Jo say incredibly important, but I picked out this, that it's the moral injury of recruiting people who are facing an impossible task, who are relentlessly criticized, who don't have the support in place, who don't have the correct training, who don't fundamentally have the right frontline supervision to model and enforce and coach what is good. That's where culture starts. in the police service. That's where culture starts. In the prison service, we have completely neglected that. And you're now having people who are in an impossible situation trying to deliver a job without the resources to do so. And certainly in the prison service, that has to explain why the vast proportion of people who are now off sick, and it's an eye-watering number, are off sick due to stress, because we're placing them in an impossible job.
Okay, thank you, Ian. And thank you everyone, Joe and others. Let's move on. Time is against us. We need to move on now to the next section, which is just called Solving Crime. And there are kind of two areas that are focused on in the manifesto. First of all, the Labour say they want to drive up the proportion of crimes solved by reducing barriers to bringing charges, cutting bureaucracy, improving collaboration. And there is also something on direct entry scheme for police detectives. I'm not suggesting that we dwell particularly on the direct entry point, though there may be some, some important points there, not least of all because it's recognised that there is a shortage currently of detectives, which is contributing to delays in the investigation of serious crimes. But let's just talk about this briefly, about this notion about reducing barriers. I mean, is there a risk, Ian, that if we reduce the barriers to charges and cutting bureaucracy, we're going to risk rough justice? We're going to kind of cut corners in the interests of justice, which actually ultimately ends up being an injustice.
Oh, that's a very big question. I didn't think you were going to ask me first on that. So I will just say that, yes, again, what I see here is in increasing and extending powers in these proposals, always. I think what we need to get back to is realizing across public services that what we need to do is make what we have better, rather than relentlessly increase powers and and laws and offences and so on, to give the suggestion of improvement. I'm just going to leave it there because I've spoken enough.
Can I say something about this? And I just want to segue into the next session, which is about victims, because this is a manifesto, and it says we need a handful more detectives, and the next bit says we need to do something about the CPS. It's such small stuff. When you think of what the Labour Party did when they came in 97, when they had the Human Rights Act, when they had youth offending teams, which actually I think have done more harm than good, but it was big stuff. The freedom of information, there was really big change going on, and now we're talking about recruiting a couple more detectives, and it's going to make a difference on solving crime. And I just think we should be thinking much bigger. We should be thinking about first principles. We should be thinking about there's real change needed. Tinkering around in the criminal justice system is not going to help victims. One of the things that when I was at the Howard League we thought about doing was, as a symbolic change, changing the name of the criminal justice system to the victims' justice system. It would be a big thing. That doesn't mean giving victims, exploiting them by getting them to stand up at the end of a trial and saying how hurt they've been, which may or may not be a good thing and appropriate, but actually focusing around victims in a more holistic way. We can do some really big things to make the system, whether it's a criminal justice system or a victims justice system, work much better for people and for communities. This is not it. Hiring 3 more detectives is not it. I think it's really sad.
Let's get on to Bill, we'll get on to the victims one, the victims stuff in a sec, because it's an important area in the manifesto. Before doing so, and I think Francis, you've maybe kind of teed up this next point I was going to make, is we're going to do a couple of polls during this event, and this will be the first one, which will be going up on your screens very shortly, which is broadly speaking just asking you, what do you think, given what you've heard so far, what you know about the Labour manifesto, is it really going to, here, it's just popped up on my screen. What, based on what you've heard overall, how do you rate Labour's approach on criminal justice? So there you go. Get your votes in and we'll share the results of that poll shortly. But let's move on to the next section, which is on justice system that puts victims first. There are 2 or 3 pledges there. There's one on increasing the powers of the Victims Commissioner. I'm not suggesting we dwell on that one, but there's another couple which are, I think, maybe, potentially more significant. First of all, an expansion of the role of associate prosecutors, as they're called, in the Crown Prosecution Service. And the other one is what the Labour says, a review of sentencing to ensure that it's brought up to date. Well, let's just start with associate prosecutors. They don't have to have a formal legal training, and the implication of this is that individuals without formal legal training will be given a greater role in decisions and actually, indeed, in terms of the actual act of prosecution. I mean, Phil, do you think this is maybe kind of risk justice on the cheap here?
I'm sort of slightly still mulling on Francis's challenge, and I guess my sort of thought about this, and I'll come back to the justice point, is we've seen some attempts over the past 20 years that I've been involved in doing big reforms, and quite often they lead to disastrous results. So I'm not sure I necessarily agree with Francis about doing big things. On the points made in the Labour manifesto about victims, I mean, one of the things that we've pushed into what we did is we have really terrible data collection on victims. Now that's not very sexy for a manifesto, but it's important. And so I guess part of this discussion is how much we should worry about commitment number 58 in a manifesto, and how much we should actually be scrutinising the plans for government. When we've looked at things like victim services provision, it's hampered by the fact that we don't know who they are, and we don't know how many times they come through the system. And it's really basic stuff. So I guess I'm just sort of wondering whether big systematic change is quite what we should be looking for when the machinery that delivers it is so broken. So I'm just sort of pausing on that, which I guess brings me also to the review of sentencing, which is probably the biggest double-edged sword in here. Like, well, what does that mean? It's in a sentence or in a paragraph that talks about victims of violence against women and girls not receiving appropriate sentencing. So are we talking about a review of sentencing that is about transparency? Is it about up-tariffing? Is it up-tariffing all offences? Is it about saying we can't cope with the demand we have? It's a very short phrase for a very complicated issue.
Doing a lot of heavy lifting there, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. All right, let's move on. We're on to the final section of the Labour manifesto now, at least the final section on the crime and justice bit, getting a grip of our prisons and reducing reoffending. It's a bit of a mixture of stuff in here. There's a pledge to use all relevant powers to build the prisons so badly needed, which is part of a broader, arguably one of the biggest themes in the Labour manifesto overall. I think, just a kind of a pledge to shake up the planning system, of which building more prisons is part, but only part. There's some stuff here about reducing reoffending, which feels rather 2010, I kind of feel in some ways, improving access to purposeful activity, pre-release plans, link prisoners with local employers, identify and support children of prisoners to break the cycle of crime, which kind of maybe sounds slightly Orwellian, actually. And then also a kind of a strategic review of probation governance. Francis, I know you're going to have some things to say about this one. What do you think?
It's this macho thing about we can build more prisons than you. My prisons are bigger than your prisons. And it's just dreadful. It's absolutely dreadful. I mean, the Tories have actually built new prisons. And of course, this all started really with when Michael Gove said he was going to close the Victorian prisons because he wanted to release the land. And he was going to build lovely new shiny prisons that would work better. The only prison he closed was Holloway, and the only Victorian bit about Holloway was a stone griffin they found in the garden somewhere. So they're not closing prisons. They're not going to close Wandsworth. They're spending millions and hundreds of millions of pounds on building massive mega prisons, which are already getting appalling reviews and inspection reports with people dying. And a lot of the real problems that have hit the headlines recently have been in prisons that have only been open for 10 or 20 years. So they're relatively new. And these are hundreds of millions of pounds. Now, my argument is, if you think there's this thing in America called justice reinvestment, and if instead of spending, I don't know, £500 million on building a prison in Wrexham, which is a poor area that's seen industrial decline. They put it into the prison into an area which had been industrial. So instead of spending £500 million on building a new prison and then spending 30 or 40 million pounds every year for the next century, if they'd said to local people, let's have crime reduction, let's do all sorts of exciting things, what would you like to do with £500 million and £25 million for the next 100 years? We could do a lot of crime reduction and we wouldn't need the prison. So let's not build new prisons. Let's not be macho and pathetic about it. Let's instead invest all that money in preventing the crime in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I think, can I just jump in here? Because I think Francis has actually put the nail on the head completely. There is nothing in this manifesto that actually tackles the problem further upstream at all. And it is incredibly unambitious to say, let's build more prisons at this point, I think. Yeah.
Okay, we're almost at the end of the Labour manifesto. Oh yeah, go on, Ian. Sorry.
Just a short point, and it's I mean I agree with Francis. You need to pick yourself up off the ground. That we are spending millions of pounds on effectively bigger warehouses. We have a system where we have far too many people being locked up by far too few staff for the good that we can do them. We need to have a fundamental discussion about who we're sending to prison. But the other point that I wanted to simply make was that prisons, our high security prisons in particular, ought to be part of our critical national infrastructure. They hold more national security risk in this country than most prisons in Western Europe. And when you have a prison like Whitemoor, which was inspected last year, and the chief inspector called it the filthiest prison he'd ever inspected, I would simply make the point, if you're unable to empty the bins in these places, what else is going wrong? The prison's problem is about resources, but it is not simply about resources. It is also about culture, and it is also about leadership. And those two things are virtually never talked about by the people who talk about prisons. And I often wonder why that is. Much easier to talk about shoveling more money into the system or diverting money from the system, which I tend to agree with, than it is about saying, who are the people who've presided over this disaster, because they are culpable to some extent as well. If you want decent prisons, you've got to deal with that as well as putting more money into the system or diverting people from the system.
Thank you. And I think as one of the points has been made in the chat that actually, if anything, the current spending plans imply a reduction in prison officers going forward over the next 4 to 5 years, and certainly not an increase. And so, again, the way that you're expanding the system, you're building more prisons, who's actually going to staff them and make sure the bins are emptied, as well as obviously the more kind of high level and important functions.
Well, can I just add very, very quickly, if you're going to have more prisons, you're going to have more prisoners, you're going to have more people who are going to come out and release, and you've got a probation system that can't cope with the current population. So I think it's good that there's a strategic review of probation. Again, that does a lot of heavy lifting.
Okay, thank you.
The one bit about the children of prisoners, that's actually, I mean, not so much about preventing them becoming criminals. It's actually a very important point. We don't have any means by which we collect information about the children of prisoners. And that, of course, impacts directly on women in prison. So, something about having, a national collecting point or even a local collecting point about who the children are, where their parents have been taken into prison is actually not a bad idea.
And this was a point that a few people when we did the call out, a few did come back and say, well, how about prisoners' families? How about the children? So that's thank you, Joe. Right, look, we've got to the end of the Labour Party manifesto bit, but we've got, I think we've got the poll results that perhaps can be shared in a second. Let's see. Everyone see that? So not a single person here, which is not a scientifically conducted survey, isn't there? But a single person thought that the Labour manifesto, based on what they've heard, is a good step forward. And majority thinking doesn't touch the size of what's needed. So that's really interesting. Thank you for your thoughts on that. We're going to put up another poll now, which is just looking ahead. And the question really is about what we think. Here we go. By the time of the next general election, do you think the problems facing the justice system will be largely resolved, somewhat resolved, same old, or even worse? So get voting, and we'll come back to that one in a bit. let's move on to the Conservative, Lib Dem and Green Party offerings, which we don't have much time to discuss, and we've prioritised Labour because they're likely to be the next government. But it's worth saying there's a lot of overlap between the manifestos. So the Conservatives are also pledging more police officers, though not the Lib Dems and the Greens. But the Conservatives and Lib Dems are certainly pledging more neighbourhood policing. Conservatives, Lib Dems, Labour and the Greens are all pledging to tackle violence against women and girls, and all parties are pledging to tackle reoffending and address the court's backlog. So, but there are some unique, as it were, sort of specific pledges in the manifestos that are unique to those parties. And let's just touch briefly on those. So let's start with the Conservative one, which is kind of almost a negative manifesto pledge. We will stand firmly behind the legal doctrine of joint enterprise, meaning that those who assist in crimes from the getaway driver or the weapons supplier can be held accountable. Now, that was a kind of a big kind of argument in Parliament earlier this year. It's a private members bill trying to change the law on joint enterprise. Interesting that the Conservatives say we are pledging not to do anything, but also the other main parties, Labour in particular, not pledging even to look at this issue. I don't know whether there's any thoughts on that one, or whether we just move on. I don't know. It's an unusual pledge, really. We're pledging the status quo. Okay, I think the answer is let's move on. All right, but worth mentioning anyway. The Liberal Democrats, interestingly, are pledging to rebuild public trust by scrapping police and crime commissioners and replacing with local boards. They're the only of the 3 or 4 parties looking at here who are actually pledging to scrap police and crime commissioners. Labour did in the past, but are not currently doing so. Ian, what do you think about the Lib Dem pledge to scrap police and crime commissioners?
I'm quite attracted to the idea, actually. I mean, I was talking earlier about having democratic accountability for the local delivery of policing. What I'd probably like to see is that accountability in perhaps in the way the Lib Dems have described about an enhanced power for local authorities. Maybe include local prisons or resettlement prisons as well. I know it's not an exact fit, but you've got lots of people coming into prison in the local community, and having some democratic accountability for what happens to them when they're in prison, and particularly when they come out in relation to resettlement, doesn't seem like a bad idea. I think policing and crime commissioners are an unnecessary bureaucratization of policing, and by and large they haven't achieved anything, and that is frankly because we're still operating in a culture where you've got retreads, political retreads, and others who've failed in other ways being offered sinecures by local parties of either stripe, usually Labour and Conservative, to go into these roles, and they've not made a great fist of it. So it sounds a good idea. In practice, it hasn't been properly delivered, at least. So yeah, I mean, why not? The Lib Dems don't have a mission, of course, but it's an entertaining one to consider.
Well, I mean, I guess if Labour don't, or if the polls aren't quite what we think, we could, I suppose, theoretically have a Lib Lab coalition or some kind of pact anyway. Yes, Phil.
I think the interesting thing about this commitment is when you look at the Labour manifesto, I think it mentions PCCs once. It clearly is describing a more muscular Home Office. So certainly PCCs look like they're going to be changed, if not scrapped by Labour, because it's definitely envisaging a much more active centre to policing than we've had over the past 14 years.
Okay, interesting. Any other thoughts on the PCC point?
I agree with Ian.
There you go. Well, that's a win then. Brilliant. Let's move on to the Green Party, who are the only party who pledge what they call an end to the routine use of stop and search and to the use of facial recognition software. I'm not quite sure whether they mean the routine use of facial recognition software or just facial recognition software more generally. Again, a very controversial kind of emerging technology, increasingly used, and of course stop and search are very, very unpopular in many communities. Any thoughts? Anyone have any thoughts on those particular pledges? You have to pick on someone if there's a.
I think it's Barney, but I'll move on.
Okay, Jo, did you?
I was just going to say something about facial recognition technology and the routine use of it by private companies, you know, in shopping malls and in things. I can see why there are kind of civil liberty issues that sit underneath the routine use of facial recognition technology. So I have some empathy with that. But it's the other part of the Green Party's manifesto on human rights, democracy, and justice, where I am almost speechless. So they are making a commitment to campaign to end violence against women, right? Which, you know, to me, that doesn't actually sound very much like a manifesto commitment. But and I'm bound to say this, you know, it's the Green Party and their commitment to self-identification for trans people that is the most problematic, because you can't deal with that, everything that we know with prisons, by actually kind of introducing a more liberal approach to self-identification where it comes to prison populations. So, of course, I was bound to say something about that.
And Labour,
Yeah.
there's a report this morning in the Times about that in relation to Labour, which I imagine you've seen, which is
I haven't.
Labour have come forward with their plans effectively for a form of self-ID, which will be like a 2-year cooling off period after applying for a GRC. So this one may run a bit, and maybe we need to return to that in a future webinar. All right, shall we have a look at the polls, the next poll or the final poll about how optimistic? Here we go. Same old, 56%. Even worse. Well, that's interesting. I suppose there's an issue here, and this has come up in the chat about where the resourcing is and the degree to which, you know, these are small steps trying to address a much bigger problem, whether it's just in terms of resourcing or the size of the problem. So maybe that's partly behind that. 1 in 10 of us think that some of the issues might be somewhat resolved. So, well, there we go. All right. Well, look, I think we've run out of time. So I think all it does is it leaves me to thank our 4 panelists for having some spirited disagreement, as well as kind of finding some points, I think, where there's some quite strong agreement, you know, across, you know, kind of political and sort of philosophical positions. So that's interesting. And a kind of a general sense that maybe, you know, whatever Labour is offering, it's, you know, there's kind of a needs to do better, really.
Yeah.
So look, thank you so much for everyone who's joined and has watched our proceedings. We have recorded this, so we will make it available via our YouTube channel within the next few days. And if you registered or attended, you will certainly get notification of when that recording is available. So thank you very much for attending, and see you at our next event. Thank you very much.